shit. There you go.
All this for a child who isn't here.
What the hell do... Ah!
You ungrateful, selfish wretch! You come into my house! You lay your filthy man hands on my daughters, and now...
How's it feel?
I want to drown in your blood.
Yes, yes! You even try to steal my property! How dare!
With Resident Evil 4's VR mode arriving, and to be perfectly honest, it's probably going to be out, and I'll be playing it by the time I get this video up, but nevertheless, I wanted to take a moment to show my appreciation for Capcom's first full-fledged VR experience. And while I know 7 was the first in VR, Village was the first to fully incorporate VR controls, and let me tell you, RE8 in VR not only serves as a true benchmark of what a AAA VR experience should be, but is also one of the most impressive VR experiences on PSVR 2 as of yet. The VR update for Village truly feels like it was something that was made from the ground up for VR, despite the fact that VR wasn't initially accounted for when developing the main game. Not only this, but the VR update improves Village as a whole and makes it a much stronger entry in the series overall, heightening the game's horror, immersion, and gameplay. Right off the bat, the sense of atmosphere and immersion in the VR version hit hard. Having played the standard version of RE8 several times through now, I hadn't expected on being wowed by the VR version as quickly as I had. But the moment I booted up the menu, my jaw was on the floor. It was unreal standing there in the menu screen and seeing the village as though you were actually there for the first time. I was taken aback by the overall clarity, including just how real the mountains looked, looming in the distance. And just to be clear on the visual experience here, there was some degree of blur and graininess in the mid to long distance objects, though oddly enough not on the mountains. And I'm not sure if this was just due to a mirror effect from the OLED lenses, which is something that doesn't necessarily affect everyone, or if it was just a bit of blur due to not utilizing foveated rendering. I suspect RE4 will be telling in that nature, but I'm not exactly sure, but there was a bit there. But once you get to playing, this issue pretty easily fades into the background, and more often than not, it feels like you've stepped right into the PS5 game itself, with just as much detail, if not more than the base version, as you're actually standing there in the game. So something that may be a little difficult to see on a TV or a monitor, you can easily see in VR because it's right there in front of you in full detail. You're in it. Objects closer to you especially look unbelievably detailed, especially Ethan's hands and various firearms. In regards to the text and the menus, they all look really crisp and clear, so there's nothing to worry about there. You've also likely noticed the vignette by now, and this is something that you can turn completely off. It's just there to reduce motion sickness. And while it's noticeable at first, once you get to playing and you get a little bit used to it, it quickly fades from your attention entirely, going almost completely unnoticed. So it's not as bad as it may look here, but it's going to be pretty obvious and pretty noticeable here, but when you're actually playing, it's not. Now that all those visual disclaimers are out of the way, let's move on to the impact of the PSVR 2's HDR lenses. The HDR lenses do incredible work in making the blacks truly pitch black, lending more horror to the game's darker areas. Therein, the flashlight is absolutely essential in the game's darkest moments, and it's super satisfying to venture forth into the darkness with a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. slowly pushing through the dark and facing what emerges to meet you. It's truly indescribable and peak Resident Evil. The haptics in the headset and controllers also made for a much more immersive experience. The subtle vibration of the headset as flies buzz around your head, or a more immersive rattle from firing a high-caliber handgun, goes a long way, and much more than it may sound. From the steam rising off of a hot meal, to the chilled fog clinging to the dark village streets, the VR version of Village achieves a greater level of immersion and atmosphere than the standard version could ever achieve, making the Village setting and the horror of the game all the better in retrospect. All the things I mentioned previously contribute to the added horror, but it's also all the details you might have missed in the standard version. Here, every jump scare is impossible to miss, as you're standing in the game. I'd played this game 5 or 6 times through on the standard version, so I didn't expect there to be many scares left for me, as my last few playthroughs had none. But the VR version completely refreshed them for me, and despite thinking I knew the game like the back of my hand, I still found myself filled with dread as I walked around every corner, even when I knew when and where a jump scare would occur. It's still so impactful when you're there experiencing it firsthand. Not only this, but certain bosses and enemies that didn't make much of an impression on me the first time around were truly terrifying in VR, where scale and details are on full display. Particularly the final boss of the castle left me completely awestruck, when it had little impact on me in the base game. Needless to say, for the previous reasons, the sheer presence of the VR port completely outshines the standard game, making for a much more solid entry in the Resident Evil series, simply by being an exceptional VR port. But let's dig in a little bit deeper into what VR adds to the overall gameplay experience, and how it also impacts the game overall. In Village's VR mode, so many things that used to be animations for Ethan are all manual now, whether it's pumping your shotgun, or forgetting to, reloading, using a key, or picking up an item. Everything can be performed through fully realized VR controls. Even the puzzles are completely interactable, which does wonders for the puzzles in Village. The puzzle houses are a lot more satisfying to interact with, and some of the later ones were surprisingly a good deal more challenging too. Also, the piano is fully interactable, which is just a delight. One of the only things that it doesn't let you do this with, however, is the bolt cutters. This is a little disappointing because it's the only glaring omission. I mean, look at this clip from Horizon. It would have worked great here. But never mind that. For the most part, it's great, it's all inclusive. And during all of this, the game no longer pauses for Ethan when he's inserting a puzzle piece or unlocking a door. This adds immensely to the game's tension, horror, and immersion. If Lady D or her daughters are chasing you, there's no moment of rest where you're scrolling through a submenu to put in a key. You have to take it out of your inventory and do it in real time all the way through, which again, adds a lot to the tension and the horror of the experience, as you have to be a lot more mindful of your surroundings. And yeah, that even counts for the most horrifying part of the game. You know the one. It's just one of the ways that all of this interactivity synergizes into a heightened experience. One thing that Resident Evil 8 does that, frankly, every VR game on PSVR 2 should do, and that's use the touch capacitive sensor on the grip button. And what this allows you to do is, instead of holding down the grip button to maintain your grip, you can just touch the button, and as long as you don't bring your finger up off of the button, your grip will be maintained. And what this does is it makes VR a lot more palatable for longer play sessions. And it just makes a world of difference. It's still mind-blowing that almost a year later, this isn't a standard. But these are the type of VR actions that should serve as a gold standard for any any flat to VR port, and I can't wait to see how they refine this further with RE4 VR. But before we get too sidetracked, let's dive back into the impacts of this VR interactivity on combat. Let me show you a moment that really showcased this synergy in my mind. I'm exploring the castle with my map, which is also an interactable piece in the game that you can't pause for, and an enemy pops up behind me. I turn around, deciding I want to test out the bayonet I've attached to my shotgun. I fire a round to weaken the enemy, poke it a time or two, and then it gets up. And I realize the bayonet probably won't drop it, and I realize it's right in my face, so I frantically try to pump at the shotgun to fire another shot, but I'm too panicked to do so, and I kind of fumble it. And as the zombie closes in for the bite, I threw a frantic punch, and imagine my surprise when it actually lands, and it staggers the enemy back, and I throw another, and then suddenly the tables have completely turned. This is a moment where the tense action horror turns into one of the most cathartic gaming moments and workouts, as I just feel so empowered using my fists to punch the zombie out. When Resident Evil Village launched, some people didn't really gel with the combat in Village, finding it frustrating given how slow your aim is and how sporadic and quick the enemy's movement was. Others also just didn't love the balance between action and horror. It's not slow and tense enough to capture survival horror completely, nor is it arcadey enough to really be satisfying for them. I didn't necessarily feel this way, but a lot of people did. It was a little more mixed in regards to combat. And it goes without saying that the combat is dramatically different here. After all, you are the controller. If your aim is slow, it's because you are. Your reloads are only as quick as you are. They're not animations anymore. You're doing all that manually. You're the deciding factor. And some people are naturals at it when it comes to gun combat in VR, but others can struggle with it tremendously. One reason for this is due to the fact that you're occupying a 3D game world. So the tilt of your gun impacts the trajectory of the bullet over longer ranges. So if you find your aim is failing, it's your fault. Luckily, Capcom added a shooting range so you can accustom yourself to this change before diving in and using some of those precious resources in the field. For me, I can be both a crack shot and miss like crazy, sometimes all in the span of the same encounter, but nevertheless, Resident Evil 8 is one of the best feeling VR shooters out there at the moment. Not the best, but really top tier. So when you take all of the VR elements that we've been discussing, from having to keep in mind your weapon tilt to the manual reloads, and all of the interactions, and you add that into an action survival horror game, the combat really shines, but so too does the horror. Because when enemies close in and you have to manually reload, it can be really easy to succumb to the tension and just fumble something, which only adds to further tension and horror to the game. And it really complements the series in a compelling way. So much that you really hope that eventually every Resident Evil can be experienced this way. And with RE4 getting the same treatment, the future of Resident Evil VR is bright. But let's not get too sidetracked. Another addition to the VR mode and combat is throwing your knife, and by God, is this satisfying, whether you're just throwing it to hit a goat or a barrel without wasting a bullet, or you're hunting or vandalizing Lady D's castle, or whatever it is that fancies you to throw a knife, whether in the heart of combat, this mechanic just never gets old. And for the final major addition to combat, which is dual wielding. And what else is there to say? It's a blast. Given what I mentioned earlier about what it's like to handle a gun in VR, you can imagine just how difficult it can be to dual wield proficiently here, but whether you're doing it skillfully or not, it's a great time. And, if you're dual wielding a hand-to-gun lightsaber combo or something like that, it's awesome. You know, what else can you say? It's awesome. Moving on now, let's talk a little bit about the story, which also is improved by VR a little bit. Despite all of the glaring issues with Chris and some of the other elements within RE8's story.
Hey, do you know anything about what's going on around here?
It doesn't make any sense.
It was still something that I really loved overall, but a lot of people didn't love Ethan and all of those aforementioned issues. And if you were one of those people, when you experience Ethan's story in VR, he somehow manages to be a bit more enduring, and it's a little easier to put yourself in his shoes. And besides this, VR enables you to roleplay to an incredible degree.
I'm sorry. We'll be safe in here, won't we?
Safer here than out there, that's for sure.
Leave me alone.
No, we're getting out of here. Together.
Such that you can really mold Ethan and his personality a lot more in this mode as you play. But even after all of this, the story still doesn't strike your fancy. The other improvements to the experience still elevates this game a tremendous amount. It also adds a lot of replayability with the game, as I'd played it through so many times I wasn't sure how many times I would want to play it again in VR, but once you're in it and you experience it and you see all the new things you can do, and it's just, I played it like 3 or 4 more times, and I could easily see myself jumping back into it over the years, plenty more. But I would always want to do that in VR rather than just playing the standard version, just because it's that much better. So we've talked about all the ways that it enhances the game, but let's just run through a couple of nitpicks here and there. The first is that there was, oddly enough, no trophies support for this, which was a real disappointment because I was wanting to go through and clean up those trophies that I hadn't gotten with these VR replays, but for whatever reason, just not enabled, which really sucks for the people that are VR only, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense, I don't think. And so I'm hoping that they really fix that mistake moving forward and implement trophies in, and it would really be nice if they would just update the game and enable the trophies, but who knows. Secondly, there's some bit of weird jankiness with the cutscenes. So there are some that it switches to cinematic mode, so you'll kind of be taken out and you'll see it like it's on a screen in front of you. And other times you'll stay on Ethan and you'll experience the cutscene, but while most of the time those play really well, every now and then they won't, like if you move or something, and that's really the main issue with it, because you can move at any point, so you can kind of move yourself off of where Ethan is supposed to be anchored, and it kind of messes the cutscene up. But this can actually be as entertaining as it is kind of taking you out of the experience. It's kind of a dual-edged sword there. I don't know, it doesn't happen terribly often, and when it does, it's kind of interesting, I guess. I don't know. And the last major complaint is sometimes whenever you're grabbing the coat and the items in it, it can sometimes grab the wrong thing, or you can struggle a little bit, and in the heat of the moment that kind of gets in the way of things, but it isn't too bad. I think that's something that they could easily have ironed out by the time RE4 VR comes out, and for future entries as well. And even if you're looking to go back to this, say you just jumped into VR, you have it for the first time, it's still not that big of a deal. It's still a great experience overall. So yeah, those were all the downsides, and we talked about all the upsides, and hopefully you guys have some added perspective on RE8 VR. And that does it. That's all of my thoughts on RE8 VR in a broad sense. it's a really exciting direction for the series, and I really hope that they keep up with these VR ports because they're incredible and some of the best experiences in VR, and I think they go a long way to show other AAA developers just how a VR port should look, and that we do need them. They're fantastic.
There will be enough for everyone. Urema,